My name is Ashley Thompson. I'm 35 years old, and it's been exactly 17 years since my father kicked me out of his house and told me I'd never be anything. Today, I'm back for my brother's wedding, and I'm about to show him exactly how wrong he was. The salt air of the Hamptons usually smells like freedom, but today it felt like a tightening noose. I gripped the steering wheel of my rented SUV, my knuckles turning as white as the paint on the sprawling Thompson estate looming ahead. 17 years. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My blonde hair was pulled back into a low, sleek knot. No flashy highlights, no designer clips. I wore a charcoal silk dress that cost more than my father's first car. But to the untrained eye, it was just a plain gray garment. That was the point. In my world, power didn't need to scream. But in my father's world, if it didn't have a gold-plated logo, it didn't exist. I pulled into the gravel driveway, the crunch under my tires sounding like breaking bones. Valets in crisp white shirts swarmed the Ferraris and Lamborghinis lining the path. When I rolled up in my mid-range rental, the young man at the door gave me a look of mild pity. "Parking for staff is around the back, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but dismissive. "I'm not staff," I said, handing him the keys. I didn't correct him further. I didn't tell him I could buy the entire valet company with the dividends from last quarter. I just stepped out and felt the humid breeze pull at my hem. The house was a fortress of white pillars and blooming hydrangeas. Music, classical and expensive, drifted from the gardens. It was beautiful, and I hated every inch of it. This was the house I was kicked out of at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag and $100 I'd swiped from the kitchen jar. I took a breath, smoothed my dress, and stepped onto the porch. I wasn't that scared girl anymore. I was Ashley Thompson, CEO of Aethelgard Holdings. I had torn down empires and built new ones from the rubble. But as the heavy oak doors swung open, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't here for the man who discarded me. I was here for Chris. My little brother was getting married, and he was the only bridge left to a past I'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to outrun. I stepped into the foyer, the scent of expensive lilies hitting me like a physical blow. And then I heard it, that sharp, booming laugh that used to make me hide under my covers. "Well," went the voice, echoing with a mock surprise that made my skin crawl. "Look what the wind blew in from the gutter." I turned. There he was, Robert Thompson, looking exactly like the king of his own hollow mountain. My father stood at the base of the grand staircase, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked exactly the same, only the silver at his temples had turned a stark, predatory white. He walked toward me, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the marble floor, the sound of a countdown. "Hello, Dad," I said. I kept my voice level, the way I did when I was closing a multi-billion-dollar merger. He didn't hug me. He didn't even reach out a hand. Instead, he circled me like a vulture inspecting a carcass. His eyes, cold and sharp, raked over my charcoal dress and my unadorned wrists. 17 years, he mused, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "I expected you to return with a bit more polish, or at least a husband who could afford to buy you a necklace. You look like a librarian on her way to a funeral." "I'm here for Chris," I replied, ignoring the barb. I'd heard better insults from disgruntled board members. "Where is he?" "He's upstairs, being a success," Robert snapped, his facade of amusement cracking just enough to show the bitterness underneath. "He's marrying Sarah, a woman from a family that actually means something. Not that you'd know anything about legacy. You chose the dirt, Ashley, and looking at you now, it seems you're still covered in it." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive cigars and aged peat surrounding him. I hope you didn't come here thinking there's a place for you at the head table. I've put you in the back, near the kitchen doors. I won't have my guests wondering why a Thompson looks like she's struggling to pay her rent." I felt a flash of heat in my chest, but I pushed it down. "The back is fine, Robert. I'm just here to see my brother." "Ashley!" The shout came from the top of the stairs. I looked up, and finally the ice around my heart thawed. Chris was sprinting down the steps, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, a massive grin on his face. He didn't care about the marble or the guests or our father's scowl. He threw his arms around me, nearly knocking the wind out of me. "You actually came," he whispered into my hair. "I was so worried you wouldn't." "I promised I would, didn't I?" I pulled back, looking at him. He looked like the boy I'd protected, just grown up and broader. "Don't get too comfortable, Christopher," Robert interrupted, his voice like a cold shower. "Your sister was just telling me how much she enjoys her simple life. Now go finish getting ready. The Van Burens are arriving, and I won't have the groom looking disheveled because he was busy welcoming the prodigal failure." Chris's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to argue, but I squeezed his hand, a silent plea to let it go. This was his day. I wouldn't let Robert ruin it before it even started. "Go," I whispered. "I'll find my seat. I'm not going anywhere." As Chris reluctantly headed back up, Robert turned to me one last time. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss. "Stay out of the photos, Ashley. I don't want to have to explain your wardrobe to the press." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the center of the foyer. I took a deep breath, the scent of lilies suddenly feeling like they were choking me. I reached into my small, unbranded clutch and felt the cool, hard edge of my phone. One text to my assistant would reveal everything. One phone call could end Robert's ego in seconds. But not yet. The wedding was just beginning, and I wanted to see the look on his face when the librarian finally closed the book on him. The ceremony was a masterclass in performative wealth. It took place in a glass-walled pavilion overlooking the Atlantic, where the waves crashed against the jagged rocks in perfect, choreographed rhythm. Hundreds of people sat in ghost chairs that shimmered like ice, their designer perfumes mingling into a scent that smelled like old money and new secrets. I sat in the very last row. My view was mostly the backs of feathered hats and the occasional glimpse of Chris and Sarah at the altar. Sarah looked like a vision in lace, her veil trailing behind her like a fallen cloud. Even from this distance, I could see the way she looked at my brother. It wasn't about the Thompson name, it was something real. When the I do's were exchanged and the cheers erupted, I followed the crowd toward the reception tent. It wasn't really a tent, it was a temporary palace of silk and crystal. I checked the seating chart near the entrance. It was a massive mirror with names etched in gold calligraphy. I scanned the top, the inner circle, the Van Burens, the DuPonts, the titans of industry. My name wasn't there. I scrolled down, past the business associates and the friends of the family. Finally, I found it, at the very bottom, table 42. I walked toward the back of the room, past the towering floral centerpieces that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Table 42 was tucked behind a large marble pillar, so close to the service entrance that every time a waiter emerged with a tray, the swinging door clipped the back of my chair. My table mates were a collection of Robert's obligatory invites, a distant, senile great-aunt who kept calling me Brenda, and a man in a poorly fitted suit who turned out to be the family's former accountant from 20 years ago. "And what do you do, dear?" the aunt asked, her eyes squinting through thick glasses. "I work in finance," I said simply. "Oh, a bank teller? That's nice. Stable work for a young lady." I smiled and took a sip of the lukewarm water. Across the room, I could see the head table. Robert was in his element, holding court. He was laughing loudly, his arm around a man I recognized instantly, Marcus Thorne, the CEO of a tech conglomerate that had been hemorrhaging value for months. I knew why Robert was laughing. Thorne's company was his biggest investment, and Robert was desperately trying to project confidence to the other sharks in the room. He had no idea that my firm, Aethelgard, had been quietly shorting Thorne's stock for weeks. Robert wasn't just losing money, he was standing on a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. The salad course came and went. The air in the back of the room was heavy with the smell of scorched garlic from the kitchen. From the front of the room, Robert's voice boomed over the speakers as he took the stage for the first toast of the night. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as silk and twice as artificial. "They say a man's legacy is measured by the company he keeps. Looking around this room, I see power, I see prestige, I see the future of the Thompson name." He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the dark corner behind the pillar. He found me. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. "Of course, some legacies are harder to maintain than others. Some branches of the tree just refuse to grow." The room chuckled nervously. I felt the accountant next to me shift uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't blink. I just watched my father, realizing that after 17 years, he hadn't changed at all. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to make sure everyone saw me lose. Robert stood under the glow of a crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of light. He held his glass aloft, the amber liquid catching the glare. The room had fallen into that heavy, expectant silence that usually precedes a profound moment. But I knew my father. He didn't do profound, he did tactical. "Success is a choice," Robert said, his voice echoing off the silk-draped walls. "It's a commitment to excellence, to the weight of a name. My son, Christopher, understands this. He's built a life that honors our heritage. And Sarah," he nodded toward the bride, who sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on her plate, "Sarah is the perfect addition to that legacy, a woman of ambition and grace." Then he turned his head. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The spotlight followed his gaze, swinging away from the head table and cutting through the dimness of the room until it hit the marble pillar next to me. The light bled over the edge, catching me in a harsh white semicircle. "But then," Robert sighed, the sound amplified by the microphone, "there are those who choose the opposite. They choose to walk away from greatness, to wallow in, well, I suppose mediocrity is the polite word. I haven't seen my daughter Ashley in nearly 2 decades, and looking at her tonight, sitting there by the kitchen door, in a dress that looks like it was plucked from a clearance rack, it's clear she hasn't spent that time climbing any ladders." A few people tittered. A woman at a nearby table whispered something behind her hand, her eyes darting toward my cheap charcoal silk. My skin felt cold, but my blood was beginning to simmer. "I hope the meal is better than whatever you've been eating for 17 years, Ashley," he said, his voice dripping with a fake paternal concern that felt like acid. "I truly do, because while we celebrate empires tonight, you remind us of what happens when a Thompson loses their way. You aren't just a guest, Ashley, you're a cautionary tale, a stain on a name that used to mean everything." The room went beyond silent. It was that vacuum of sound that happens right after a car crash. Chris stood up, his face flushed with a dangerous shade of red. "Dad, that's enough," he hissed, but Robert just waved a hand, dismissing him like a nagging fly. I didn't look down. I didn't hide behind the pillar. I sat upright, my spine a steel rod, and looked Robert right in the eye. I felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes on me, some pitying, some disgusted, all of them judging. Robert wasn't done.
He took a long, triumphant sip of his drink. "I'm a generous man, though. Despite the embarrassment, I let her stay. But let's be honest, some people are born to lead, and others are born to wait for the scraps. Enjoy the scraps, Ashley." He turned back to the important guests, ready to transition back into his toast, as if he hadn't just tried to publicly disembowel his own child. But he'd made one mistake. He hadn't looked at the bride. Sarah wasn't looking at her plate anymore. She was looking at me, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp realization. She looked at the way I held my glass, the specific, effortless poise of someone who spent their days in rooms far more powerful than this one. Then she looked at Robert, and for the first time, I saw true fury cross her face.
The silence that followed my father's words was thick, like stagnant water. I could feel the eyes of the elite burning into me, looking for a tear, a bowed head, or some sign of the stain he had described. I didn't give it to them. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the polished floor, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the quiet. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal dress. My heart was pounding, not with shame, but with the cold, hard clarity that comes when you finally stop caring what a monster thinks of you. "I think I've had quite enough of the scraps, Robert," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in that vacuum of sound, it carried to every corner of the tent. Robert's eyes widened, his face flushing a deeper shade of puce. "Sit down, Ashley. You've already embarrassed this family enough today. Don't make a scene." "The scene was your doing," I replied, stepping out from behind the marble pillar. I started walking toward the center of the room, toward the head table. Every head turned, a sea of silk and tuxedos parting for me like I was a ghost they couldn't quite believe was real. "Security!" Robert barked, his voice cracking. "Someone remove this woman. She's clearly unstable." Two large men in black suits began to move from the edges of the room. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on Chris, who was struggling to get past the heavy table, and then on Sarah. Sarah was standing now. She wasn't looking at the security guards. She was staring at me, her hand pressed against her throat. Her eyes darted from my face to the simple, unbranded watch on my wrist, a piece of horological art that cost more than my father's SUV, something only a true insider would recognize. "Ashley? Wait!" Chris called out, finally breaking free of the chairs. "It's okay, Chris," I said, stopping a few feet from the head table. The security guards reached for my arms, but before they could touch me, a sharp, commanding voice rang out. "Don't you dare touch her!" It was Sarah. She had snatched the second microphone from the center of the table. Her voice was trembling, but it wasn't with fear. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Robert turned to his new daughter-in-law, a forced, patronizing smile on his lips. "Sarah, darling, it's all right. I'll have this handled in a moment. We won't let her ruin your beautiful night." "Handle it," Sarah whispered into the mic, her voice gaining strength. She looked at Robert as if she were seeing him for the first time, seeing the rot beneath the expensive suit. "You have no idea what you've just done, do you?" She stepped around the table, her long white train rustling like dry leaves on the floor. She walked past Robert, ignoring his outstretched hand, and came straight to me. The room held its breath. "Ashley?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Ashley Thompson from Aethelgard?" I looked at the woman my brother had chosen. I saw the intelligence in her eyes, the same spark I'd seen in the eyes of the young girl I'd decided to bet on years ago. "Hello, Sarah," I said, softly. "It's been a long time since the scholarship ceremony."
Sarah didn't just look at me. She looked through the version of me my father had spent the last hour inventing.
She turned back to the crowd, her hand gripping the microphone so hard her knuckles were as white as her dress. "Most of you know me as the girl who worked her way up from nothing to build an architecture firm," Sarah began, her voice echoing with a newfound, sharp authority. "What none of you know, what even Chris didn't fully know, is that I wouldn't be standing here without a ghost." Robert stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion. "Sarah, what are you talking about? This is our night. Let's not get sidetracked by—" "Be quiet, Robert," Sarah snapped. The room gasped. No one spoke to Robert Thompson like that, especially not in his own house. She turned her gaze to the rows of investors and socialites. 12 years ago, I was a student with 3 jobs and a mounting pile of debt I couldn't pay. I was days away from dropping out until I received a letter. It was from the Thompson Empowerment Fund. It paid for everything: my tuition, my first office, my first 3 years of overhead. It saved my life. She looked at me, her eyes shimmering with tears. The fund was anonymous. All I knew was that it was founded by a woman who had been cast out of her own home for wanting to be more than a trophy, a woman who built an empire called Aethelgard Holdings from the dirt up. The name Aethelgard rippled through the room like a physical wave. I saw Marcus Thorne, the CEO my father had been sucking up to, drop his fork. It clattered against his porcelain plate, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. He knew, they all knew. Aethelgard wasn't just a firm, it was a predator, the kind that ate companies like Robert's for breakfast. I spent years trying to find my benefactor to thank her, and I find out today that she's been sitting at table 42. I find out that the woman who gave me my future is the same woman her father just called a stain on this family. She walked right up to Robert, who looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He was trembling, the glass of scotch in his hand vibrating. "You called her a failure, Robert?" Sarah's voice was a low, dangerous hiss that carried perfectly through the speakers. "You're standing in a house that was foreclosed on 6 months ago. Did you really think your private investors were just being kind? Or are you too arrogant to realize that the holding company that bought your debt, the company that effectively owns the roof over your head right now, is a subsidiary of Aethelgard?" The silence wasn't stagnant anymore. It was electric. Robert's eyes darted to me, then to Marcus Thorne, then back to me. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his reflection shatter in real time. "She isn't the failure," Sarah said, turning back to me and reaching out her hand. "She's the only reason you still have a name to boast about." I took her hand. Her palm was warm and steady. I looked at my father, and for the first time in 17 years, I didn't see a giant. I saw a very small, very frightened man standing in a palace built of my mercy.
The crystal glass in Robert's hand finally gave way. It didn't shatter on the floor. It simply slipped from his nerveless fingers and thudded into the thick, cream-colored carpet, the amber scotch blooming like a dark, ugly bruise. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a scandal. It was the silence of a boardroom right before the executions began. I could see the shift in the room. The titans of industry, men like Marcus Thorne, were no longer looking at Robert. They were looking at me. Their postures straightened, their expressions smoothing into the masks of polite, desperate respect they reserved for people who could destroy them with a single signature. "Ashley!" Robert's voice was a ghost of its former boom. It sounded thin, reedy, and old. You never told me. Why didn't you say anything?" "I didn't come here to talk about my portfolio, Robert," I said. I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the hardwood perimeter of the tent, the sound sharp and final. "I came to watch my brother start his life. I came to see if, after 17 years, there was a single ounce of a father left in you." I stopped right in front of him. Up close, I could see the fine web of broken capillaries on his cheeks and the way his hands were shaking. He looked pathetic. The monster that had haunted my nightmares for nearly 2 decades was just a man in an expensive suit, drowning in his own ego. "You're the owner of Southbrook Holdings?" he stammered, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "The company that bought the mortgage? You've been paying the staff? The upkeep?" "I've been keeping the lights on for 3 years," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Not for you, for the memory of the home this used to be. For Chris, so he'd have somewhere to come back to. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? You had to take one last swing." Chris stepped up beside me, his arm brushing mine. He looked at our father with a mixture of pity and profound disappointment. "You really are a piece of work, Dad. You spent the last hour mocking the person who saved you from the street." I can make this right," Robert said, his voice rising in a desperate, frantic pitch. He turned to the room, his arms outstretched. "Everyone, a misunderstanding, a family joke that went a bit too far. My daughter, the CEO, a Thompson through and through. Let's have a toast to—" "No," I said. It was just one word, but it cut through his frantic bluster like a blade. The room froze again. Robert looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. "There are no more toasts for you tonight," I said. I looked at Sarah, who was still standing by my side, her chin held high. "This is Chris and Sarah's wedding, and you are no longer the host." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small silver pen. I didn't need it for anything, but the sight of it, a tool of my trade, seemed to make Robert flinch. "I told you I'd find my seat." I leaned in so only he could hear me. The scent of his expensive cigar now smelled like decay. "I found it. It just happens to be the one you're sitting in." I turned my back on him then. I didn't need to see his face anymore. I felt a strange lightness, as if a heavy coat I'd been wearing for 17 years had finally slipped off my shoulders. "Chris? Sarah?" I said, my voice warming for the first time. "I believe there's a cake that needs cutting, and I believe I'm still at the wrong table."
The rest of the night passed in a blur of champagne and soft light. Robert didn't stay to see the cake being cut. He slunk away into the shadows of the estate he no longer truly owned, leaving his half-finished glass of scotch as the only evidence he had ever been there. Without his booming, suffocating presence, the air in the pavilion finally felt breathable. Sarah and Chris insisted I move to the head table, right between them. As I sat down, I realized the important guests were no longer whispering. They were waiting for me to speak, their eyes filled with a desperate hunger for my attention. Marcus Thorne actually leaned across a floral arrangement just to offer me his card. I didn't take it. I didn't need a card to know he was terrified of my next move. "You okay?" Chris whispered, leaning over to bump his shoulder against mine. "Better than okay," I said, and for the first time in 17 years, I meant it. "I'm sorry if I overshadowed your night, Chris." "Are you kidding?" Sarah laughed, her hand finding mine under the table. "That was the best wedding gift anyone could have given us. You didn't just save our house, Ashley. You saved my husband from a lifetime of thinking he wasn't enough." As the band transitioned to a slow, soulful melody, I watched my brother lead his bride onto the dance floor. They looked happy, not Hamptons happy with forced smiles and calculated poses, but genuinely, radiantly alive. I slipped out of the tent before the party ended. I didn't want the handshakes or the networking. I walked down to the edge of the lawn where the grass met the sand. The Atlantic was a deep, restless indigo under the moon, the waves whispering secrets to the shore.
I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had walked away from this house with nothing but a bruised heart. I wished I could tell her that she was right to leave, that a legacy isn't something you inherit through a name, it's something you forge through the lives you touch and the people you lift up when the world tries to keep them down. Robert thought wealth was a weapon to keep people in their place. I knew it was a tool to build a bigger table. I walked back to the front of the house. My mid-range rental SUV was parked right at the front now, brought up by a valet who stood at literal attention as I approached. "Have a safe drive, Miss Thompson," he said, bowing his head slightly. I hopped into the driver's seat. The interior still smelled like cheap air freshener and old upholstery, and I loved it. It reminded me of where I'd started. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The white pillars of the estate were shrinking in the distance, becoming just another house on a long, dark road. I wasn't a stain on the Thompson name. I was the only thing about it that still had any value. I rolled down the windows, letting the salt spray and the cool night air fill the car. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. I wasn't running from a shadow. I was driving toward a light I'd built with my own two hands. The road ahead was open, and for the first time in my life, the name Ashley Thompson felt exactly like home.